Everyone. It's great to have you with us. I'm Karen Ricks, Executive Director of Early Music America, and I'm a keen eater, as are most of you, I'm sure. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel today that revolves around food and wellness. And I'm particularly happy to have two musicians who have devoted a good chunk of their lives to food and eating and preparing food, and to coaching others in how to enjoy food, how to make it part of their lives, as well as a member of EMA who's a great food enthusiast and whose idea this was in the first place. So I'd like to introduce today, I'm going to introduce Sarah Canna. Sarah Canna is a Baroque violinist, a food blogger, and a culinary coach. She's normally based in the city of New York. Right now, she is spending the quarantine period a little outside there, but she is working from there with her food blog. I'm also going to introduce Tekla Cunningham. Tekla is familiar to many of you. She is a Baroque violinist. She is founder and artistic director of the Whidbey Island Music Festival and co-artistic director of Pacific Music Works in Seattle. She is also a marvelous baker. She might describe herself as a baking enthusiast, but I'd go a lot further than that. She is a baking expert. So we're going to hear a little bit more from Tekla about that. And then also Thomas Carroll. Thomas is a historical clarinetist and instrument builder, and he has been a food enthusiast from birth. His interest in food predates his interest in music, in fact. Thomas is based in Boston, and I'm going to hand it over to each of you to just say a little bit about what food means to you and what it means to how you got into it first. Let's talk about how this became sort of intertwined in your life, particularly as a musician. And then we'll start with Sarah.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really nice to have a conversation like this. Music and food are very connected in my life, and it's really nice to be able to share that with others. So similarly to Thomas, I have enjoyed cooking even before I started playing violin. So very early in my life, I started to experiment in the kitchen. And, I didn't really take it super seriously. I always liked to do it, but it was in college that I really started to learn how to cook the way that I wanted to eat. And it started when I was a sophomore in college. And my freshman year, I had spent, I was at Temple University, and I was so excited to finally be in a music school setting. I went to a normal high school with a good arts program, but I hadn't really had a chance to dive in as a musician. So I was spending all of my time practicing, and I wasn't making very much time for me and my own self-care. And so when I started my sophomore year, I kind of felt like something was missing. My body wasn't feeling right. I was very tired. And even though I had been practicing all these hours and hours and hours, I wasn't really making the kind of progress that I wanted to on my instrument. So I made it a goal of mine to really learn how to make healthy food taste delicious. And so that's when I started my blog, The Hungry Musician, to kind of chronicle my adventures in the kitchen and making this delicious, healthy food. And along the way, it was really interesting because I was spending significantly less time practicing, but I was making a lot more progress much faster on my instrument because I was being more intentional about the time I was spending with my instrument. And also I was treating myself better. So ever since then, and that was about 10 years ago that I started my blog, food has been completely integral in my life as a musician. I would not be able to function every day without it. And just like we're discussing here, it really is an aspect of my wellness. And wellness can mean so many things, but it helps exercise my creativity in a different way. It helps to nourish me and fuel me. But it's so important to me. And that's why I choose to help others with it as well.
Thank you, Sarah. It's really great to see how these passions emerge and become intertwined so closely with your music. Tekla, do you want to talk a little bit about your background with food?
Sure. Thank you, Karin. It's great to be here. And it's really fun to have this discussion around food, which is so, I think, elemental for all of us. So I grew up in a family of really good home cooks. My mother's German, my father's American, and I had grandmother, different traditions on both sides of the family. My dad's mom, she grew up on a wheat farm, and from the age of 6 or so, she was responsible for making these large farm breakfasts. So I think I definitely grew up around people who knew how to feed large families, and that was always part of the conversation about, what's the next meal and what's our next family gathering going to be like. My father studied in Vienna in the late 60s and came back, I would say, with a really strong taste for Middle European delicacies, and married my mother, who's German. And so I think when they set up their own household in Seattle, they were definitely trying to recreate some of the experiences they'd had in Europe that were not possible in Seattle in the early 70s. So one of the things my father would do is he would always bake bread at home. And these were the days of kind of Wonder Bread, and before there was this big revival of the artisan bread movement. So we had homemade bread, and he in fact would trade with another friend of his who was an importer from Afghanistan. He would trade these Afghan carpets and lapis lazuli jewelry for his bread. So I think there was definitely a culture around food, and it was always something that we took a lot of pleasure in as a family. And I then kind of got into reading cookbooks and collecting cookbooks, which has been a whole other journey for me. And for me now, I think it's just always been something that's a part of my life, and I always enjoy planning. I think it's very social for me, so it's a lot of has to do with planning social gatherings, planning meals with family, planning sort of looking at the calendar year, and there's definitely kind of a rhythm to the year for me in terms of what kinds of foods I make and bake. And it ramps up a lot around the holidays, which is always a little bit tricky with the concert season. So I have a lot of just really fun memories of Christmas holiday concerts mixed with my my kind of list that I have of holiday baking. So, but I'd say for me, it's really a great way to connect with my friends and family. It's a great way to share time with people and to just really enjoy. And for me, it brings me a lot of pleasure sharing food with others.
Thanks, Tekla. I can attest that Tekla had a little more time to bake this year because it's one of very, very few bright spots in the last year, and did a couple of online baking classes, which I think were very successful. Thomas, tell us a little bit about your interest in food.
Well, thank you, Karin. You introduced me as someone who, has been obsessed with food since birth, and I think I've been very fortunate to be raised in a household where food and the culture surrounding food has always been sort of an important thing. My parents are both American, but while they were still teaching, they were professors of French literature and philosophy. And so that meant that there was a lot of French influence in the way that my brother and I were raised, to the point where every summer growing up, we would live in France for 3.5, 4 months during the summer. And so at a very early age, I kind of cultivated this sense of, this is what I like in food. These are these flavor combinations that, seem exotic because I'm experiencing them in Paris or in Normandy. And they're things that we can't really get, or we don't have access to as easily in the States. And so I think, as a child in elementary school, I'd come home from elementary school and we didn't have cable TV at the time. And so the only thing that I could watch was PBS. And around 4 p.m., 5 p.m. would always be when the cooking shows on PBS were on. And so I would see a lot of these old reruns of, Julia Child and the De Medici Kitchen and things like that. And so, as a kid in first and second grade, a lot of the play, pretend scenarios that I would, do with my stuffed animals and, with the little model dinosaurs that I had in my room were, oh, this is a restaurant. This is, I'm making something out of Legos and I'm serving it to this lion over here. And so I always felt that there's this, aside from the taste and, the act of creating something, there's always been this idea of a social aspect of food. And so, as I've gotten older and established myself as a professional performing musician, one of the things that's always struck me as interesting and one of the most rewarding parts of what we do as performers is that there's this sort of universal appreciation for food that goes through the music community, especially I think in the early music community where we're constantly on the road traveling back and forth between all of these cities that each have their own different food cultures. And so that's kind of the thing that really draws me to food and to experimenting in the kitchen and to trying to recreate those flavors and to try to reach different ways of creating things if I don't have the equipment or the ingredients at home to do it.
Well, I'll jump in here. I'm David Wood from EMA, and I think we might be having some difficulty with Karin's connection here really quickly. But thanks so much, Thomas, for telling us about your food background. So one of the things that you each brought up and sort of the goal of our conversation today was to talk about how we can see and how we might think about food and cooking and the actually act of preparing food and ultimately enjoying the food itself, preparing it as a wellness activity. So I wonder if anybody wants to sort of go first and talk about how you see this as part of your own way of keeping yourself sane or focused or whatever, maybe specifically during this last year during the pandemic as things were thrown into such disarray. Would someone like to take a first shot at that?
Sure, be happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think, one of the things that doesn't stop no matter what happens in life is you have to feed yourself. And I think as musicians, one of the things that I really appreciate about my fellow musicians who love to eat and cook is that I think we have a kind of an aptitude for that kind of constant improvement and sort of figuring out, we're good at practicing, we're good at learning things. And I think musicians are really terrific cooks because they're also very keen observers. And have, I think, a really strong sensory awareness. So I think that's something that is definitely that I've noticed about musicians who cook. And for me, in terms of wellness, I find cooking to be very meditative and baking. I've done a lot of bread baking this year. I've kind of jumped on the sourdough train with a lot of other people. Just having things unfold over time and something like watching a dough evolve over 24 hours is something that's it's sort of fascinating, and it slows things down to a very, human pace. You're not, and this is kind of a year when we're not rushing around anyway, because there's a lot less happening because of the pandemic. But I enjoy, I also just really love working with my hands. And one of the things I love about playing an instrument is that just the sort of the tactile part of it, the physical part of it. And for me, baking is also just the tactile experience is something that I love. It's just, touching the dough, just doing things with my hands, making a thing. I think music is so rewarding and so ephemeral. And we don't always get a beautifully packaged CD after every week of projects. And I think something I've always loved is, you make a thing and then you can eat it. So like with a cake, you can create something with your hands and then you can share it with people. And so that's something that I really enjoy about it.
What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I totally love what you said about it being meditative, because that's exactly how I would describe it for myself as well. I think obviously I had times too when I would get home at the end of a long day after tons and tons of rehearsal, and I would be like, oh, well, I don't really want to make dinner now. But once I got past that, it was the highlight of my day sometimes, coming home and making dinner and having that creative product, right in front of me that I could eat and enjoy that would make me feel good. So that is for sure an aspect of the wellness thing for me with cooking. But as it relates to music more specifically, and my life as a musician and my wellness in that regard, I think that I know that cooking as a creative outlet is really important to me. Because I think, and maybe I don't know if you two or you three agree, having music be your career is so fulfilling in so many ways, but it can be tough sometimes when it is a creative outlet in itself, and it is also your job, because you're spending so much time and so much energy pouring your creativity into your work. And that can be very taxing sometimes. And so it's really nice to have something else that you're passionate about, that is creatively motivated, that you can, pour yourself into at the end of a long day. And it is still, you get that creative hit and you get that product afterward that you can be proud of, but it's not necessarily related to music. And so then I find that it really feeds back into my creativity as a musician to have this other creative outlet.
Thomas, do you find a similar interplay between your music and food?
Yeah, I very much agree with everything that Sarah and Tekla said. I think for me personally, some of the times where I felt most fulfilled as a musician have been when I've come home from a long day of rehearsals, or maybe a dress rehearsal, or a concerto rehearsal where I wasn't like 100% happy with how everything went, and I was in my headspace of thinking about like, I want to fix this before the next rehearsal or the recording session or whatever. And I come home and I just sort of go into the mindset of, okay, well, I'm just going to cook myself a really nice dinner and pour a glass of wine and just let everything fall away. And then I have I prepare a meal that like might be a comfort food or something like that. And then afterwards, I find that all the energy that's been sapped out of me from the day is just immediately replenished. And even if I don't feel like there's an immediate urge to go and pick up the clarinet and go back to woodshedding a passage, it just feels like everything has just sort of been fixed. And then the next day, it all magically comes together. And I think, my relationship with, food as a means to sort of create this level of like familiarity and comfort, especially when we're on the road and we're in environments that are not familiar and not necessarily the most comfortable. If we're, using hotel equipment to cook, or if we're on buses all night. I think that is like the constant thing in my relationship with food that keeps me honest about myself as a musician. So that's one of the things that kind of stands out to me.
So one of the things about food that I think about is that we use a term with food that we very seldomly use with other things, which is we talk about comfort foods, right? We don't talk about necessarily like our comfort art on the wall or our comfort music. We might have things that are comfortable. We talk about comfort foods. And I'll have Sarah start with this one. If you were to think about something that you would consider comfort food, what is it, and why is it a comfort food to you?
Well, I'm going to go a little bit more broad with this because I always have trouble picking one thing. When someone's like, what's your favorite food? I'm like, I have no idea, like all of it. So I think, but in terms of comfort cooking, my favorite thing to do in the kitchen, and this is why I love this time of year, is just making something hot in one pot, bubbling on the stove, like a soup or a stew or a curry or something like that. And I think to me, it's, first of all, it's just something about having a big, hot, bubbling pot. It's just so comforting and just warms you on the inside, But there's something magical about just throwing a whole bunch of stuff in a pot, and by, tweaking the steps or throwing one thing in before another thing and putting a little thing in here and there, it's not that precious. You just experiment, and then something really delicious comes out. when you eat something hot that's just come off of the stove and it's, you ladle a big spoon of it into a bowl, it's just like you're getting a hug from the inside out. And so that's my answer.
What about you, Tekla?
Thanks. Yeah, Sarah, I love how you describe that. And I think one of the things I also wanted to mention just about the sort of magical aspect about cooking is there's almost a way we're kind of alchemists. When we come into the kitchen, we take these very simple ingredients and just through heat and time and technique, like there's a real alchemy and a magic that happens, I think, in the kitchen. So I love how you describe that pot of soup. I think for me, comfort food, I have to go with apricot dumplings, which is our family thing that nobody else knows about. It's an Austrian thing, and it's these sort of Middle European fruit dumplings are kind of a whole genre. There are all kinds of different kinds of dough. There are potato doughs, there are Topfen or ricotta doughs, and this is something that my dad made when we were little, growing up, and it's basically an apricot. In Vienna, they take out the pit and put a little sugar cube inside. You don't have to do that. And then you make a dough of either Topfen, which is quark, or ricotta, cream of wheat, and an egg. And you roll your apricot in this dough, you simmer it in water until it floats, and then you roll the whole thing in breadcrumbs, which you've fried in butter until they're golden brown. And then you slice it open, and you have this apricot, the dough layer, and then the crunchy outer layer, and it's this kind of textural, wonderful textures and combinations. And for me, it's just, I always think of my dad making, so it's just kind of like you said, just a big hug. And I think now my son really loves these. So we have these kind of not competitions, but they're friendly competitions. How many bits are left on your plate at the end of the meal, so you can see who does, who is victorious by how many apricot bits are on the plate. So that, I have to say, is I think my very favorite food.
That sounds delicious. And if you have a recipe for that, maybe we can put that in the chat, or if you know of one that we could share, that would be
sure. Yeah.
Thomas, what about you? What do you think of when you think of comfort foods? What's that mean to you?
I definitely agree with Sarah. Like putting stuff in one pot and just letting it sit, and waiting for the food and the heat to do its thing. I think for me, that's really one of the things that I very much am a fan of. For the past few months, Stew Monday has kind of been a thing that I've been doing, where I'll just make a giant pot of stew on Monday that will last me through, most of the week, but I vary the ingredients. And so I don't know if it's any one type of stew, but I'm very much a fan of the one pot recipe, not just because it's something easy to do, but for me, it kind of represents the creative process. You're putting all of these different elements into it, and you're stirring it a little bit, but mainly you're just letting it cook and settle and bubble and simmer on its own. And then at the end, something beautiful comes out of it.
That's right. That's, I'm thinking about my crock pot. I use my crock pot a lot, and put something on early in the morning and just works all day long. It's just cooking away very, very slowly. And then you take the lid off and it's just so glorious. I'm sorry that I disappeared from the call. My computer died, and I have no idea what happened, but thankfully smartphones can fill the gap. So I'm sorry, I probably missed all sorts of incredibly interesting things, and forgive me if I repeat something that you've already said. But I wanted to, Tekla referred to those apricot dumplings, and it reminded me of these amazing apple dumplings that the Amish make and sell at Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about food in different places, because as early musicians, you travel a lot. And before this broadcast started, Sarah and Thomas were referring to some time they spent together in Houston and exploring the food scene there. And I know you've all traveled a great deal. Let's talk a little bit about food in this country, in North America, on your travels, and the places that have struck you with, interesting things that you found, or just something that may have struck you in one of your trips, perhaps unexpectedly, or just something that you really enjoyed. Sarah?
Well, one thing that immediately came to mind was a couple of years ago when I was in San Francisco. This was right as I was starting my early music journey officially. This is right before I started at in the Juilliard Historical Performance Program. I went to San Francisco to do the American Bach Soloists Academy. And a friend of mine who I was doing the program with, we took a walk over on our lunch break over to this banh mi shop that is about a 10-15 minute walk away from the conservatory. And I will never forget how good that banh mi was. And whenever it's safe to go back to San Francisco, first of all, I really hope that banh mi shop has survived. It's been a really horrific time for restaurants and small businesses, but this place, it was like a little hole in the wall. The banh mi's were, I think, like $4. It was, which is, obscenely cheap, especially for San Francisco. So that's going to be my first stop next time I'm in San Francisco.
What about you, Tekla?
Well, I love that memory, Sarah. So for me, I have kind of a policy when I travel of not cooking because I like to eat. I like to see what's happening around. And I have some friends, one friend, Catherine Motuz, she travels with her sourdough starter, which I think is extremely admirable. But I tend to try to just see what's going on in terms of food and find some delicious things to eat locally. Maybe I'll cook a meal or two if I'm staying with a friend, but I try to really explore. And I think the place I am most, except for home, is in San Francisco in the Bay Area. So there are a lot of things that I really enjoy eating there. There's so much amazing. I always like to go to the farmers markets when I'm down there, just because the climate's so fantastic and there's so much great food in the winter. And I think just one of the things that I always love is the sort of post-concert meal. I've got a couple friends, Deborah Nagy, the oboist, and Steve Bard, and when we're in San Francisco together, we kind of after a Sunday afternoon concert, we'll tend to go out to a new restaurant every time and explore something. So that's been a really fun tradition for me.
Thomas, what's something that stands out to you when you've traveled?
Well, I think the city of Houston in general is sort of like my favorite place to go for food while I'm traveling. I'm usually there multiple times a year during the season, and I never get bored of exploring all the different options for food. Like, it's one of the only cities in the country that I know where you can start the day with like a breakfast taco from a cart outside the hotel. And then, maybe after the first rehearsal, go to a Vietnamese restaurant serving very traditional Vietnamese food that's absolutely delicious and just light enough to get you through the next rehearsal. And then after dinner or after the afternoon rehearsal, go to, a barbecue place where they're doing fusion barbecue and maybe doing some Korean inspired barbecue. And you don't really get that in a lot of in a lot of cities where all of that food culture from various different global cultures is all concentrated in one, small geographic location. San Francisco and New York are other cities where that's very present. But I think, for me, like Houston, just because I've been there so often, is one of the cities that stands out to me.
Thanks. Yeah, Los Angeles is probably another city that has that amazing food selection all within a relatively short distance, but unfortunately the traffic makes it much harder for you to get from place to place to enjoy it. I wanted to bring David now into the conversation because Tekla, you referred to somebody carrying their sourdough starter around with you, and it won't have escaped any of us that there's been a sourdough craze during the lockdown. And I know that David has been part of that craze, and I would love you to talk a little bit about why it is perhaps that this took people's imagination, and why so many musicians have been eagerly showing off their baking online. David, perhaps you could start with that and then pass it on.
I had started with my sourdough about a year before the pandemic. I had done it because I'd always baked, but I'd never actually kept this. I'd always used, instant yeast or active dry yeast or something like that. And so I had my family and I, we'd spent a month in Europe the summer before in 2019, and I came back and I was just so over the American bread selection that I was like, I'm going to do this. But I really think that one of the things that took off a lot of people, number one, is they were home, so they had a second pet, that they could take care of, which was that starter. And I know a lot of people even took on the catching wild yeast by creating their own starter in their home, as opposed to buying a starter or getting it from a local bakery. And I think there's sort of like a Mr. Wizard science fair situation going on there, where people really were interested in that part of it. But I do think that one of the things about sourdough and mini sourdough recipes is that there isn't a lot of hands-on time, but it's a very long process that takes many steps, and a lot of times you need to be there for it. So now that I'm working from home, it's okay for me to start my leaven the night before or in the morning, and then having it's actually accessible to me to do a stretch and fold every 15 to 30 minutes during that part of the process. Whereas when during the regular before times, if I was on campus teaching or something like that, I just didn't have access to that. So it was reserved for a weekend activity. So I think people just found that they were within arm's reach of their kitchens, and so that really developed. And then I'm not sure, maybe a beautiful loaf right out of the oven is super comforting. And I like the idea that you can practice it. And I'm not sure how many of the rest of you, Sarah, Tekla, Thomas, have actually taken on the sourdough at all, either in the last year or before. Sarah, do you want to talk about your sourdough experience?
Sure. Similarly to you, I took it on before the pandemic. I think it was like the winter of 2018 was when I first started. And I grabbed some starter from a friend. I did not make mine myself. And oh yay, bread. I don't have any. I made a bunch of loaves to send off to family members who I couldn't be with for the holidays recently, so I don't have a lot left over. But there is just something so cathartic about waiting around for this thing to happen and not actually doing very much. It's really just time, temperature. There's not much you can physically do besides the shaping of the loaf itself to make it turn out a certain way. It's really interesting. And it's actually kind of similar to preparing a piece in a way, and that there's lots of little intricate details that depending on what you choose to bring in or what you choose to leave out, the end result can turn out very differently. So that's why I really love making sourdough. And also with a starter, because you have to feed it all the time, you end up with all this leftover stuff. So you can put that in delicious things like banana bread and pancakes and crackers and stuff. So lots of fun little offshoot projects can come from that I enjoy those too.
Quickly, you brought your one of your loaves actually into the conversation.
This is a loaf I made yesterday, and I always like making bread, but this year I've started making a lot more bread. And one of the things that I really love is to be able to use more whole grains, or at least a little bit of whole grain. And I think there's been a huge resurgence in American artisan baking, and a lot of it's really with white flour. And one of the things that I loved when I lived in Austria and sort of for my German family, and there's this whole other tradition of rye breads and really hearty grains and incredibly nutritious and wonderful breads. And one of the things I've been doing is that I started doing actually with a friend of mine who's also an EMA board member, and he sort of turned me on to this these local mills near where I live. And so we've been have a little flour co-op now, and we get this wonderful freshly milled organic wheat that's really, really delicious and much cheaper than what you can get at the grocery store, and just bakes so beautifully. So that's kind of really changed my outlook on bread. And also my kids will eat it, which is always great.
And we're talking before, and I think more than one of us here have actually had the experience of one of, I think, the best websites for either beginners and those who have done it is, not Thomas's website, although that might be fine too, but it's The Perfect Loaf, theperfectloaf.com. And it's a wonderful place if you would like to learn how to make your own starter and take care of it. He has wonderful beginner recipes and then very advanced recipes, and mixes things up and experiments a lot. One of my very favorites is his that I just made for the first time about 2 weeks ago, and he said it's his cranberry walnut sourdough, which is delicious. So theperfectloaf.com is a great place, and I think I saw in our own discussions that at least 3 of us, if not more, have visited that website there. So
the apricot lavender one is also really delicious. I've made that one a few times, so highly recommend.
And the cinnamon rolls are insane. And the one that is dangerous that I almost hate that I know how to do it now is the chocolate babka. It's like so good. I kind of wanted to like.
Sarah, the apricot lavender was the one that you brought to our dinner party in Purchase, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. That was great.
It's a good one.
So Thomas, are you a baker or a consumer, or both?
I have not gotten into the baking pandemic craze like a lot of people. I've never really been much of a baker because there wasn't a lot of that going on in my family when I was growing up. I also have a very unreliable oven. So anything that I do bake in the oven, I have to sort of, there's no temperature dial on my oven. It's just on or off, and I can sort of turn the handle to where I think certain temperatures are, but I don't really have a reliable way of keeping it at a constant temperature for any length of time. So, 1970s appliances, not so great.
And returning to the whole idea of food and wellness, I mean, I've developed a bit of a gluten intolerance as I've grown older, and eating natural grains doesn't seem to affect me at all. So if I buy really good quality bread or really good flour, especially direct from a mill, as Tekla said, I can eat it happily. I can eat it all day long, which is great. Because who wants to deprive themselves of good bread?
And we actually did have a question in the chat and in the comments. And if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, you can put comments there, and we can see them and respond to them as we can. But we had a couple of questions, both directed for Tekla, but I thought I'd just give you both. One was a flour recommendation, but then also, where can German expats in the Pacific Northwest find marzipan?
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, it's Vienna. Hi, Vienna. I just saw that. So, the marzipan, I have a source in Seattle, and it's actually a Danish bakery called Larson's Bakery, and they have fantastic almond paste and marzipan. And you can also make it at home. And I just buy it there because it's so good. And the Danes use almond paste in everything. And it's in the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle, which is where it's kind of the Scandinavian neighborhood. That's a great place to do it. I do know people who make their own, and it's not that complicated. I have never had who done it because I have this good source. And
actually,
the other question about.
Oh, it was just what if you had a flour recommendation?
Well, so the mill that I've been getting flour from is called Nash's Organic, and it's on the Olympic Peninsula. It's in the rain shadow, and it's where, and they have different grains that they grow. And I've been getting it's a red hard wheat called Espresso. It's one of the strains of wheat. And there's another mill nearby called Cairn Spring. And then there's some other wonderful company in California. called Simple Milling, and they have a lot of different varieties. They've got everything from spelt, all kinds of different whole grains, different types of wheat with different contents. So if you're doing, bread or pastries, like flour for everything, those would be some really great sources. And again, I'm now in this situation where I buy 50-pound bags because that's how just how 2020 turned out. So I have a big tub in my kitchen where I've got 50 pounds of this and 50 pounds of that. And so.
Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about how when you're preparing either for your classes, your own baking, in terms of ingredients, like how do you, what's your mindset when approaching that?
Well, I think it's interesting because a couple of years ago, my answer would have been very different than it is now. A couple of years ago, like when I first started my blog and I was trying to teach myself how to use different ingredients, and it's still this way to some extent. I really try to go out of my way to cook with things I've never cooked with before. So I always am looking out for new ingredients that I can experiment with, or how I can take ingredients I already know how to cook with and use them differently to bring out different flavors or to highlight them in a different way. But when I'm preparing for a cooking class, like I just gave one the other night on plant-based cooking, or if I'm preparing a recipe for my blog, I know that my audience it's mostly musicians, actually. And we are notoriously busy, or at least we were. And we don't want to have to make elaborate things. We don't want to have to worry about all that stuff. So I always, in my recipes, try to use ingredients that most people have in their pantries or that most people have access to in some way. And occasionally I do try to do something a little bit special. So like the most recent recipe that I put on my blog is for a cocktail using persimmon, because I love persimmon. It's not quite seasonal anymore, but you can still find them in like Asian markets and things like that. So my cooking, it's a mixture of, it's mostly stuff that you can easily find and stuff that you can easily alter or customize based on what you have. But there is a little bit of like that special twinge to it where, we try to highlight ingredients in new ways, or, use something new that wouldn't necessarily be hard to find, but, would be something special that maybe you hadn't tried before.
That sounds delicious, that persimmon olfactory.
And I did just put a link to that recipe into the comments, so if anyone's interested in trying the persimmon rosemary old fashioned, then there. So also, Sarah and Tekla, both of you have taken your experience with food and moved it to the level of teaching, right? And helping others appreciate the preparation for that. And maybe you could start first. How did you get into sharing your knowledge about creating food with people outside of your home?
So I think for me, I always love cooking kind of for people and with people, ideally. And I've done a lot of baking, and I've actually done a lot of wedding cakes, strangely, over the years for people that I love. I have made, I don't know, maybe 8 wedding cakes. And I think that was the first time I'd done something that was more public, where it was made, to be consumed in a more public venue. And then this year I did a few online cooking classes as fundraisers, for Marzipan. It's kind of my Christmas specialty recipe that I've developed. And I did that for Pacific Music Works, and I did a fundraiser for a friend in a couple different situations where I did that class in December, and it was just a really wonderful experience. And actually on Zoom, I don't know if you've had this experience, Sarah, but I thought it was a fantastic platform for cooking together, because everyone's in their own kitchen. They've got their own stuff set up. They have their own ovens. Everyone's comfortable. They're not having to squeeze around a small area. So we could have, I think, more people in a class, unless you had a really huge, teaching kitchen. So that was a great experience for me. I really loved doing that, and I hope to do that again.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I've just started hosting some Zoom classes myself, and they're really, really great for bringing people together, and especially the musical community, actually, because like I said, a lot of my audience is musical, and so it's been able to bring a lot of my friends and colleagues together to do activities together, because we can't physically make music together right now. So it's been a really, really nice way to bring our communities together and our friends and families together. And yeah, there is something about the virtual thing. My mom was just asking me the other day, she's like, when everything goes back to normal, are you going to give these in person? And I said, well, maybe, but there is something about the virtual experience that you can't get in person. Like, I can't bring all these people together from different corners of the country and the corners of the world. I can't bring them together that way. And they can't see inside of my kitchen that way, and I can't see inside of theirs. So there is something special about the virtual teaching of cooking.
One quick comment. I saw there was a question about how does any of this relate to early music particularly, and I wanted to just speak to that briefly. So I think, as historically informed performers, I think you definitely look at things through a different lens. And one of the things I'm doing a lot of reading kind of food history and looking at cookbooks particularly, there's a sense of at least exploring what is historically informed cooking, and how did people eat, how did people live, and how were they nourished by the food culture around them. And I don't think you can tie these direct lines to music, but I think I certainly have had a lot of pleasure over the years in old cookbooks, and I have a kind of an obsession with Austro-Hungarian cooking, so I read a lot of books, and some of the old books you kind of see how the way that recipes have really changed over the years, and the way that the audience for cookbooks has really changed. And I think this seems to be much more sketched out much more loosely. So the measurements were all really different. One of the really charming measurements that I found in these old Austrian cookbooks, instead of talking about 60 grams for an egg, they'll talk about an Eischweiß, or the weight of an egg. You'll use 60 gram, they describe the weight of the egg as the measurement for the unit of that much flour or that much butter, rather than maybe grams or whatever. But I think looking at sort of the history of how people eat is as fascinating as looking at the history of how people play music and experience music. I think it's just a universal human thing to eat, and I think understanding how our ancestors have eaten is a fascinating subject.
Just jumping on what Tekla said, I've been doing a lot of research recently about composers and performers and their relationship with food, and how that leads to composition, or to the act of creation. One of my favorite stories from this it takes place in the early 1800s, and this is with young Mendelssohn and the clarinetist father and son duo, Heinrich Behrmann the father and Carl Behrmann the son. And on New Year's Eve, Mendelssohn has them come over to his house, and he promises he's going to write them something tasty if they prepare his favorite dish of potato dumplings and noodles or something like that. And so in Heinrich Behrmann's diary, there's this entry that says something along the lines of, I arrived at his home at the appointed time, and he plopped a chef's hat on my head, tied an apron around my waist, stuck a cooking spoon in the apron's waistband, and sent me off to battle. And then he returned to his keyboard, where he himself would knead salt, pepper, and sweeten before concocting a spicy sauce for it and cooking it over a hellish fire. And of course, he's talking about the composition of the piece. And then he says later, we tried the duo out the same evening, and after some technical challenges, we were able to claim that we were more delighted with the charming work than Mendelssohn was with his noodle and strudel, although he always swore that the dumpling creation was more ingenious than him. And then he afterwards, after talking more about the food, he says, we thus immediately arranged for a repeat of that scenario, which took place a few days later with the same success. And then Mendelssohn was so affected by this that he writes on the cover page for this score, he writes, he calls this the dedication of this score, the Battle of Prague, a big duet for steamed dumplings and sweet cheese strudel. And then he, goes on this long list of puns with the word bear. because they're the Bearmans, and he spells it bear, with an umlaut, and says, this took place in Berlin, and then he draws a bear on the cover page of the score. So that's one example, but also you get all of these other composers. Rossini retires from composing and dedicates his life pretty much full time for the last 20 or so years of his life to cooking. Mozart starts many of his journal entries and letters to Constanza as well as to his father while he's on the road writing, working towards the premiere of Don Giovanni, talking about what he had for dinner that day. He starts many a letter saying, pork cutlets for dinner tonight, and then goes on to talk about the body of the letter. And of course, we all know about Satie and sort of his proclivities with only eating foods that were white, and all of his other different neuroses. So, but all of this kind of ties into the sense of like creating a food culture around music. Like it's the other universal thing that all of us share, no matter what we're doing, whether we're composing or performing.
And it goes back a long time. I mean, if you think about, Lassus wrote a great deal about wine and its pleasures and its dangers. For example, there's a huge amount that he dedicated a huge amount of his work to that. And then you've got Schein and his Banchetto Musicale, which was dinner music. Though I did read that Schein died at 44 of tuberculosis and scurvy and gout and all sorts of other things so his death was probably hastened by his eating, sadly. And then of course you've got Telemann's Tafel music. All of this is music designed for a social setting. So music, I think, for a very, very long time has been intimately connected with food and with eating, with the social setting. And I know that there are people who've recreated historical dinners to go with concerts. I mean, it's as Tekla said, it involves reading these very old, complicated cookbooks and using all sorts of bits of animal that you probably haven't used before to accurately create the meal.
Yeah, I did dinner like that long ago in California, with my string quartet. We called it an evening at Esterhazy, and we created, I think, a 10-course, I can't remember what it was, huge banquet based on old Hungarian recipes that might have been eaten by the Esterhazys. So that was sort of a historical reenactment of food, and there was frozen toffee souffles and strudels and Esterhazy torta. Went on and on. It was fantastic, super fun. It was one of those moments when everything kind of converged, like all the cookbooks that I'd been reading my whole life, and then my string quartet. But it was wonderful.
Well, I'm delighted to say that Sarah is actually presenting her cooking show as part of this series for the next 2 Saturdays, January 23rd and January 30th. I don't know if you have any, you can give us a quick peek into what you might be sharing with everybody as the recipes. I know that you're planning on sharing the recipes ahead of time so that people can get organized and have everything together. But those classes are going to be at 6 p.m. Eastern time. That's 3 p.m. Pacific time next Saturday, the 23rd, and Saturday, the 30th. Sarah, do you want to say anything about those?
Sure. So earlier, David mentioned, he asked me the question about what's your favorite thing to cook in the kitchen? And I said, I just like cooking one pot meals. So like soups and stews and stuff like that. So I haven't finalized it. I will in the next day or so. But one of the meals for sure will be a chicken soup kind of thing. From scratch, chicken soup, very easy. But definitely something unique and not just your average chicken soup. So we'll definitely be doing something like that. And then the other class will be a plant-based class. So for people who don't eat animal products, we'll have something for them too.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And Tekla will also be delivering a session at some point before the end of March. The subject is still to be decided. So we've got plenty of time to think about what that might be, Tekla. And I'd also love to try and find a time to perhaps present a food historian, somebody who can talk about music and food in a more academic setting. I think that would be fun. A lot of people have done research on this, and a lot of people have done research on wine and on alcohol and music. And I mentioned Lassus and wine, but there are many other people who've done a lot of research on this. So perhaps we'll return to food and to drink, to coffee and tea. And we all know about the coffee cantata, of course. But again, there's, the kind of alchemy is created, just as it is with sourdough baking, it's created when you make alcohol as well. So are there any other questions, David? Is there anything else that we want to bring up before we take a break?
I don't see that we have any. There have been several comments about how everyone's ready to go and eat now.
Yeah.
After talking about and hearing about food for the last hour, and people are excited. I think there, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but there are some wonderful videos out there about this topic of what I might call historically informed cooking. So cooking from original sources and trying to use and decipher what some of the ingredients are. And so I encourage everyone to scour the internet and YouTube in particular to find some of those. And I had a student just this last fall who pointed out a lot of the similarities in doing historical performance with music, and then what some of these people are doing with food. And so it's a wonderful cross-section of those types of things, and allows you to sort of explore life using a different sense than using your sense of taste at that period of time. So I would encourage people to do that for sure. And I do want to mention that you can find out about all of our upcoming sessions at our website, earlymusicamerika.org/wellness, where we have Sarah's upcoming sessions where you can register for those, and Tekla's will be there as well as the many other sessions, including in just an hour from now, we'll have a Feldenkrais session that will be offered for free. And that's a Zoom session. So you can find that information at earlymusicamerika.org/wellness. And
a chance to ask Elizabeth Reed, who's doing the Feldenkrais session, about her parents have written multiple books about barbecue. Her parents were incredible and food writers. So you might want to just FYI.
Thank you. Well, I think everybody's stomach is rumbling right now. So what are you all going to eat? What's the next thing you're going to eat? Thomas, what are you going to eat now?
They had a sale on duck breast at Whole Foods yesterday, so I have one of those that I'm going to cook later tonight. And I'm trying to decide exactly what I want to do in the way of a sauce to complement it. But I also have, various root vegetables and some Brussels sprouts and a bunch of onions and garlic and some, carrots and celery. So I don't know that I'm going to make a stew out of it, but I'm probably going to make maybe a potato and a turnip celery puree or something like that to go along with it.
Sounds wonderful. What about you, Sarah?
Well, a few nights ago, like I said, I hosted a plant-based cooking class, and I'm still working through the leftovers from that. So we made a braised sweet potatoes and lentils dish, and some coconut couscous and some sesame cucumber salad. So I'm probably going to go downstairs and make myself a little plate of the leftovers so I can finally get them out of my fridge.
Leftovers are the best. What about you, Tekla?
That sounds great. I'm actually just going to eat some of this bread. Butter and some green, and I'm going to call it good right there. So, yeah.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, all of you, for sharing your passion and your expertise. It really is just a pleasure to share that, having you shared your music with us so much, and it's always wonderful to see this other dimension of a musician. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for connecting us. Joy to see all of you, and I know Thomas, but I hadn't met Sarah yet. So this is really wonderful to get to meet from across the continent. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this. It's really fun to connect with other musical foodies. It always feels like, they're like little lost siblings,
Yeah, and right now, I think it's helping everybody just get through every day, one at a time, just thinking about the next meal.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, and yes, somebody referred to, I think Sarah mentioned how much restaurants are suffering right now. And I do encourage people to, order food as much as possible directly from the restaurants and not from a third party, but to make sure that, they're getting all the income, because if we lose that one place that we've always felt was the anchor of our neighborhood, we'll never get it back again. So we must really support them as much as we can.
Yeah, I've been doing that one night a week, ordering from a different local restaurant and calling the restaurant directly, not using one of the delivery apps. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's hard to tear myself away, but we need to move on, and we have Feldenkrais in an hour. So I look forward to talking with you all again soon, and to Sarah's class next Saturday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Everybody who's watching, we really appreciate you being with us. Bye-bye.